Senator, my first question for you. I think a lot of people are finally maybe starting to pay more attention to what's going on in Ukraine. So I'm watching this in Tupelo, the Golden Triangle, North Mississippi. Why should I care about what is happening with Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think, of course, we have alliances, and we have a NATO alliance that is very much threatened by what's happening in the very next door country. So to the extent that this might bleed over into NATO and involve an Article 5 obligation to defend our allies, that's one thing. But also internationally, we've depended on a rules-based international order since World War II. This is 7 decades of the United States and democracies being able to depend on one country not challenging the sovereignty, the territory of another country. Also, we're going to feel this at the pump. We've already had huge inflation in gasoline prices, but it is our international economy, let's face it, is so intertwined that this is very definitely going to affect Americans in our pocketbook and in the way we spend our money. We're going to have to start spending more money on defense. And actually, I'm calling on the president this afternoon to submit a supplemental emergency defense package to the Congress next week or the week after, because we are going to be faced with some challenges that we really didn't expect, or at least some people in our leadership have not prepared us for. So it affects us in almost every way.
How do you envision that additional defense money being spent?
Well, we're going to ask the Secretary of Defense today if we are ready in case these 3 Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which used to be Soviet republics, in case they're invaded, those are members of NATO now. And the information I have is that NATO and the United States are not prepared to win that battle if Russia tries to move in there. We need to be ready, and we need to have the overwhelming force to show to our adversaries, like Russia and like Iran and like China in the Pacific, that we have the overwhelming force to defeat that. And that's the best way to keep the peace, is to be overwhelmingly able to win a conflict if it arises. I don't think we have the resources in terms of shipbuilding or aircraft or firepower to do that right now.
I know we just came out of Afghanistan. I know we've got a limited number of soldiers, of troops in that part of the world now. Is this something where you could easily foresee us sending more to that part of the world because of how this thing could play out?
Well, I think we'll be sending more troops to our NATO allies in Eastern Europe for sure. And the Defense Department has been doing that. There's no question about it. But let me tell you, we've shown signs of weakness that have been very regrettable. In 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and took parts of the eastern 2 provinces of Ukraine, President Obama, his response was to send the Ukrainian army meals ready to eat. We should have been sending them all of the weapons that we could spare so that they could defend themselves against these Russian-backed troops. What we did in Afghanistan, the disastrous way in which the world saw us, and make no mistake about it, President Xi Jinping in China was watching that. President Putin was watching that. Our adversaries in Iran were watching that, and they saw it as a sign of weakness. I think the sort of tepid half measures in terms of the sanctions that we've done up until today have also been a sign of weakness, even though 55 senators, a bipartisan majority, voted in favor of sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that Russia proposes to use to send natural gas to Germany. I think the absence of doing strong sanctions, the absence of a strong hand in the way we left Afghanistan has really exposed us as not being ready for a challenge like this.
Both of us are old enough to remember the Cold War. Do you see us going back to those days?
Well, right now it's a hot war in Ukraine, and this is only a few miles away from the Polish border, an ally of ours, a treaty ally of ours, and those three Baltic countries. But back during the Cold War, Ronald Reagan was president for much of that. And he called on Mr. Gorbachev to tear down that wall in a show of strength. And we had the military, we had the 500 ship Navy to back that up. What Mr. Putin is seeking to return to is what Ronald Reagan called the evil empire. He wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union, and that includes not only Ukraine, but a lot of the republics like the Stans that are now free and striving toward democracy, and also our Eastern European allies like the three Baltic countries. So it is a return of this Cold War evil empire that we very much need to avoid.
Final question, because I know you're tight on time. The sanctions President Biden just announced this afternoon, is that enough in your mind?
Well, it's not enough in my mind, but it's a lot more. And actually, it seemed to me after last night's onslaught by Russia that we should dump the entire reserve of sanctions on Russia. I think we would have taken them out of the international banking system, the SWIFT system, as it's called, except that two of our NATO allies have objected to that. We need to continue to work on that. But we need to make sure that Russia is totally isolated. And so to the extent that their airliners need parts that we control in the United States, Russia will not have those anymore. There are just so many ways in which our economies are intertwined. I hope this sends a message to Mr. Putin, but I'll tell you, Craig, he sounds an awful lot like Adolf Hitler did in the late 1930s. He sees a few ethnic Russians across the border and thinks he's entitled to invade that country. That's exactly the rhetoric that Adolf Hitler used to go into the Sudetenland and into Poland and Czechoslovakia, which led to World War II.
Senator, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Craig. Anytime.